A public museum catalog can preserve history. It can also freeze an interpretation long after the evidence base has changed. In August 2026, the research laboratories of archaeology at the University of North Carolina explained that former RL archaeologists regarded the Mount Pisgah stone carvings as fraudulent or fabricated. Their stated reasons were the collecting history of man Valentine and his associates, and the view that the carvings did not resemble objects documented archaeologically in western North Carolina or elsewhere in the Southeast. This documentary does not declare the carvings authentic. It does not accuse UNC of bad faith. It asks a narrower and more defensible question: does a categorical word like fake still fairly describe an entire, diverse corpus when the surviving documentary record is extensive? The custody history contains named and traceable nodes, and later controlled excavations at Garden Creek produced additional figurines, effigy fragments, and an unfinished effigy head. Reconsideration is not reversal. It is the ordinary scholarly duty to test an inherited conclusion against evidence that was unavailable, overlooked, or never examined object by object. UNC's response deserves to be represented accurately. It says the original carvings are not in the RL collections. RL instead curates photographs, while the original objects are presumed to remain at the Valentine Museum in Richmond. It also says that former RL archaeologists reached a fraud or fabrication determination because of the collecting history and because the carvings did not resemble documented regional or southeastern artifacts. That is a legitimate reason to be cautious. 19th century relic markets could produce copies, embellishments, mixed lots, and false stories. Unusual form is also a valid research signal, but the response does not identify the archaeologists when they reached the conclusion, whether they examined the original stones or photographs, which comparative collections they used, or whether any object received materials analysis, microscopy, toolmark study, conservation review, or laboratory testing. The disclosed rationale is therefore a general historical and typological judgment. It is not yet a demonstrated object-specific authentication record. That distinction matters because the word fake sounds like the end of an investigation, while the explanation supplied by RL identifies the beginning of one. The request is not that UNC replace fake with authentic. The evidence does not justify that. The request is that the institution separate several conclusions that are often collapsed together. An object can be authentic but misprovenanced. It can be indigenous but post-contact. It can be a 19th century reproduction made without fraudulent intent. It can be a copy of an older object. It can be a commercial fabrication. Or it can be an archaeological object whose unusual form has not yet found an accepted comparator. Those are materially different possibilities. A collecting history problem is not automatically a manufacturing diagnosis. A typological anomaly is not automatically proof of deception. And evidence that some pieces were copied does not prove that every piece supplied the model for nothing. The strongest formulation in the integrated research record is therefore deliberately restrained. Genuine collecting is documented. Allegations and episodes of later manufacture are documented. Pre-contact antiquity has not been established for every carving, and the most defensible present model is a mixed assemblage requiring object-by-object adjudication. That is not advocacy for a preferred answer. It is a demand that the category match the resolution of the evidence. A public catalog statement is not merely an internal research note, it becomes the institution's voice. When a record says Valentine fake stone carving, readers reasonably understand that UNC possesses an object-level basis for that conclusion, yet the recent response identifies no test report, examination sheet, named comparative study, or curatorial memorandum. It refers instead to what former archaeologists determined. The appropriate next question is simple: where is that determination recorded? Who made it? What objects were examined? What features were considered inconsistent? Were the original objects available? Or did the judgment rest on photographs and inherited narratives? Did the reviewers compare the carvings with figurative material, or mainly with more familiar classes such as pottery, projectile points, pipes, and ornaments? These questions questions do not disrespect prior archaeologists. They make their reasoning auditable. If a source exists, it should be named. If no responsive analytical record exists, that should also be stated. In that circumstance, neutral language such as historically described as fake, authenticity disputed, or attributed by earlier researchers to fabrication would preserve the history without presenting an inherited interpretation as a completed modern laboratory finding. The documentary record does not give modern excavation provenience to every Valentine carving. That limitation must remain visible, but it is equally inaccurate to describe the collection as though it arrived without a provenance system. The surviving correspondence records repeated efforts to capture source information. In July 1879, Valentine asked Osborne to report where objects came from so they could be labeled. In April 1880, he requested pencil slips specifying whether pieces came from highland, low meadow, river washes, underground contexts, and named places. The archive also records boxes, kegs, freight and express routes, bills of lading, payments, named landowners, finders, mound workers, and later attempts to secure witness statements. Some catalog entries explicitly lack tickets, which is significant because it shows that a ticket system existed and that missing documentation was noticed. The integrated edition now runs more than 3,000 pages because it binds correspondence, facsimiles, catalogs, analyses, and source controls into one auditable record. That compilation is not 3,000 perfect provenance tickets. It is something more modest but still important, proof that the historical stream is extensive, structured, and capable of being tested, rather than an unsupported dealer tale with no documentary spine. The correspondence reveals a repeating custody pattern. Local finders, landowners, and mound workers supplied A, J, and Mary Osborne. The Osbornes labeled or described boxes, kegs, and packages. Freight and express moved them through western North Carolina toward Richmond. The Valentine family received, compared, exhibited, and cataloged the material. Later, selected site-link Valentine collections moved to UNC. That chain does not prove the antiquity of any individual carving, but it does establish real collecting, physical transfers, and institutional custody. It also contains internal quality control. The record reports attempted counterfeits and the dismissal of some hunters, which is inconsistent with a simple model in which every object was knowingly fabricated for one undifferentiated fraud. A collector trying to distinguish genuine finds from imitations may still be deceived, but the existence of screening, tickets, and rejected pieces is relevant to how the archive should be read. The historical question is not whether fraud existed somewhere in the network. It plainly did as an allegation and, in some streams, as manufacture. The harder question is whether the entire corpus can be assigned to one workshop story without examining the objects, their labels, their technical signatures, and their distinct custody branches. One letter creates an especially important custody node. On September 23, 1884, Benjamin Valentine wrote that boxes of relics from the Swain County route had been left with Chief and Smith. The letter says the boxes were at Smith's house, that they contained important relics, that Smith was expected to send them onward, and that money had been left with the Smith family for hauling. The 1884 date and the title make the strongest identification. Nimrod Jarrett Smith, who served as principal chief of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians from 1880 to 1891. The letter alone does not identify every object in those boxes, and it cannot authenticate them, but it is far more than vague market rumor. It names a custodian, a physical location, an object group, a forwarding decision, and transportation payment. It also complicates any story in which the Valentine operation existed wholly outside Cherokee knowledge or participation. The responsible wording is that Chief and Smith represents a strong custody link for a specific group of boxes. The identification as Nimrod Jarrett Smith is highly plausible and should be verified against the manuscript and surrounding correspondence before being stated without qualification. UNC's explanation says the disputed carvings did not resemble documented artifacts from western North Carolina or the southeast. That may accurately describe the comparative record available to earlier researchers, but RLA's own later catalog now contains figurative objects from controlled Garden Creek excavations. The integrated catalog review identifies multiple figurine and effigy records from Garden Creek Mound No. 1, Site 31 HW1. Among them are a steatite effigy fragment, an unfinished effigy head and ground stone, an effigy foot, an effigy leg and foot, a deer effigy, and additional figurine fragments. These are not all stone, and they do not all resemble the Valentine carvings. Some are clay, some are fragmentary. None of them authenticates a 19th century museum object merely by existing. Their importance is narrower and stronger. They defeat the premise that figurative manufacture or three-dimensional effigy forms were categorically foreign to the site. The unfinished head is particularly significant because an incomplete object can preserve evidence of manufacture. If its field provenience is secure, it provides an archaeological test case for local material, tool marks, working sequence, and form. Exactly the kind of object-level comparator an inherited typological judgment should now confront. The relevant records should be named rather than summarized vaguely. Catalog 2115A 2535 is recorded as a steatite effigy fragment from Garden Creek Mound No. 1, accessioned in 1967. Catalog 2021A 3016 is recorded as an unfinished effigy head and ground stone from the same mound, accessioned in 1965. Catalog 2093A 591 is an effigy foot, and Catalog 2021A 3328 is an effigy leg and foot. The supplied catalog notes identify these as clay rather than stone. The user's current RL search also identifies Catalog 2093A 4084, a steatite geometric form from Site 31HW7, the Garden Creek Village area. These records raise questions, not automatic answers. The field cards should be pulled for square, level, feature, zone, and material confirmation. The objects should be photographed under raking light, examined for tool marks and use wear, and compared with the Valentine pieces under a protocol fixed before anyone sees the result. The central point is methodological. An earlier conclusion based on an absence of regional comprenda should be revisited when the institution's own controlled collections later produce related object classes. Reconsideration is triggered not because the objects are identical, but because the stated baseline has changed. A strong case must preserve differences rather than recruit every figurine into one category. The clay feet and limbs demonstrate figural representation at the site, but they do not establish stone carving. The steatite effigy fragment is more directly relevant to the Valentine soapstone corpus, but one fragment does not establish shared style, date, or source. The unfinished ground stone head may demonstrate local manufacture if its provenience is secure, but its material and tool marks still require confirmation. The steatite geometric form from the village is evidence of worked material and form, not necessarily an effigy. These distinctions make the reconsideration argument stronger, not weaker. They show that the proposal is falsifiable. A controlled comparison could reveal that the excavated objects are technically and morphologically unrelated to the disputed corpus. That negative result would be valuable. It would preserve the typological objection on a documented basis. A positive technical relationship would also be valuable. Either way, direct examination is superior to a blanket label inherited from an unnamed and undated comparative judgment. The proper research program begins with the field records, then material identification, surface microscopy, manufacturing traces, and only afterward broader cultural interpretation. The NAGPRA notice is important, but it must be used for the task it performed. The 1999 Federal Register notice announced completion of an inventory of Native American human remains and associated funerary objects in the possession of UNC. It records consultation with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the Cherokee Nation, and the United Keetoowah Band. For Garden Creek Mound No. 2, it lists 9 individuals and 50 associated funerary objects. For Mound No. 1, it lists 26 individuals and 738 associated funerary objects. It also records a separate group of remains collected by Osborne or E.P. Valentine from N. Valentine and transferred from the Valentine Museum to UNC in 1969. The notice defines its object class by funerary association. Objects reasonably believed to have been placed with or near human remains as part of a death rite or ceremony. It is therefore not a catalogue of every artifact from Garden Creek, not an authentication survey of the Valentine carvings, and not a verdict on whether a disputed object is genuine, post-contact, or fabricated. It is a legal and stewardship inventory governed by possession, human remains, and funerary association. The notice itself does not state why the Valentine stone carvings are absent, so a documentary should not invent a reason, but the known record identifies two threshold explanations. First, Dr. Lapham says the original carvings are not part of the RL collections. A notice limited to material in UNC's possession would not inventory objects held elsewhere merely because UNC curates photographs. Second, an object belongs in the associated funerary category only when the institution reasonably links it to a burial or death rite. An object from a village, surface collection, collecting hill, museum lot, or in certain context would not automatically enter that list. The omission therefore cannot fairly be cited as proof that the carvings were excluded because they were fake, nor would inclusion have authenticated them. NAGPRA and archaeological authentication answer different questions. NAGPRA governs human remains, cultural items, consultation, affiliation, and repatriation. Authentication asks about material, manufacture, date, use, and provenance. The proper question for UNC is whether any internal NAGPRA worksheet, collections note, or curatorial record separately classified the figurines, and if so, what evidence that classification used. The Federal Register notice alone does not supply that answer. The broader comparative question also deserves more precision. Human and animal effigies, figurines, pipes, vessels, and freestanding sculptures are well documented across multiple indigenous traditions of the eastern woodlands and southeast. Garden Creek, Hopewell sites, Etowah, Moundville, Cahokia, Poverty Point, Kalamoki, and other centers belong to different periods and cultural systems, so they cannot be used as interchangeable matches. Their relevance is limited but important. They show that three-dimensional figurative representation was not inherently alien to indigenous communities east of the Mississippi. The real comparative work must therefore move beyond the binary question, does this look like a familiar point type or pottery series? It should ask about material source, carving sequence, tool technology, posture, surface treatment, use wear, iconographic grammar, and archaeological context. A distant analogy cannot authenticate a Mount Pisgah carving, but a claim that the entire class is impossible requires a survey broad enough to include the relevant figurative traditions. UNC can strengthen its position by naming the comparative corpus that former RL archaeologists actually used and by showing which specific morphological or technological characteristics failed that comparison. The historical record is not clean enough for blanket authentication. It is also not simple enough for blanket rejection. The integrated evidence matrix finds that genuine collecting is well documented. It also finds a manufactured comparison stream, accusations of buried copies, attempted counterfeits, and post-contact subjects. At the same time, the strongest documentary instruments record purchases and specimens, not a commission to fabricate the entire corpus. Later testimony describes real finds and copies being sold together. Stylistic heterogeneity suggests more than one hand. The museum catalog itself includes a separately identified imitation category. None of that proves that a particular object is ancient. Together, however, it makes a mixed population more economical than a single total fraud story. The mixed model can accommodate authentic archaeological pieces, post-contact Cherokee or vernacular carvings, contemporary reproductions, commercial fakes, altered objects, and misprovenanced material. Its virtue is not that it saves the collection. Its virtue is that it generates tests. Objects should cluster by stone source, tooling, weathering, surface treatment, and manufacturing sequence if they came from common workshops. Strong context pieces should separate technically if they did not. That is a scientific program. Fake, applied to the whole corpus without disclosed object level work, is not. A constructive response requires only a bounded set of actions. First, identify the former RL archaeologists who reached the determination and the approximate date. Second, provide or cite the catalog worksheets, memoranda, correspondence, research files, or publications recording their reasoning. Third, state whether original objects were examined or whether the conclusion rested on photographs and documentary history. Fourth, identify the comparative archaeological collections and the characteristics judged inconsistent. Fifth, confirm whether any laboratory, Conservation, materials, microscopic, petrographic, or tool mark analysis exists. 6th, pull the controlled field records for the later Garden Creek effigy objects, especially the steatite effigy fragment and unfinished head. 7th, review the public wording, where the evidence is historical attribution rather than modern object level analysis. Use language that says so. Finally, invite consultation with the affiliated Cherokee tribes before new testing or interpretive relabeling. None of these steps requires UNC to authenticate the carvings. They require only that the public catalog distinguish an inherited historical verdict from a documented institutional examination. That distinction protects the institution, the archaeological record, and the indigenous histories involved. The evidence does not justify saying that the Valentine carvings have been proven authentic. It does justify saying that the blanket fake designation is under-documented in the response UNC has supplied and should be reconsidered. The collection was not provenance-free. It contains a substantial documentary and custody record, including labels, tickets, shipments, named finders, institutional transfers, and a significant 1884 custody note involving Chief and Smith. Later RLU excavations documented figurines, effigy parts, a steatite effigy fragment, and an unfinished groundstone effigy head from Garden Creek contexts. The 1999 NAGPRA notice confirms the site's native mortuary significance and Cherokee affiliation, but its omission of the carvings is not an authenticity judgment. The strongest responsible conclusion is therefore neither all real nor all fake. It is a mixed and unresolved corpus requiring object-by-object adjudication. A university catalog should be able to say that plainly. Reconsideration would not erase the history of skepticism. It would record that skepticism accurately, identify its evidence, and leave room for modern analysis to change the answer. That is not retreat. It is archaeology doing what archaeology is supposed to do. Return to the record when the record becomes richer.